administration. Trudeau saying that he spoke to President Trump about the benefits of the Keystone project and that Keystone will deliver jobs for the province of Alberta. He declined to comment on details of the Keystone negotiations. And of course, we know that TransCanada says it will reapply for that pipeline project.
Adding billions to GDP and creating thousands of jobs.
Yes. And we have the closing bell here in the United States, here in New York. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ closing at record highs, the Dow advancing 113 points. I'm Scarlet Fu.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. If you're on Twitter tuning in, welcome to our closing bell coverage every weekday from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time.
We begin with our market minutes. A record day, at least for the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. The Dow didn't quite get there. It did get fairly close to that 20,000 mark, the closest it's been in a couple of days, in a couple of weeks even. But we couldn't get there in the end. 19,912 for the Dow Industrials, the S&P adding 2/3%. The news today, this afternoon at least, was President Trump's signing a memoranda extending, or I should say, advancing the construction of the Keystone and
America open for business. Maybe that's why investors are so happy today.
And of course, again, mentioning that the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ closed at record highs. I want to take a look at TransCanada shares because they did close at a record over in Canada. And as we wait, or as we listen in on these headlines out of the press conference in Calgary, we also see Canadian energy stocks climbing as well. That's boosted the Toronto S&P TSX index, gaining 0.8%. That is the highest since September of 2014. We also had earnings coming out of Verizon and J&J and Lockheed Martin. The earnings parade continues, and you can see they're down across the board. Verizon, one of the big drags on the Dow Industrials, off by 4.4%. Disappointing numbers there.
And I'm looking at the government bond market. Let's take a look at with the U.S. going on. Yields higher across the board. We got some good data out of the U.S., which we'll be talking about in a little bit. Remember, yesterday was a pretty sharp downward move in U.S. interest rates, so a reversal today, not quite all the way, but you see the tick higher. Also looking at Turkish yields down today. The Central Bank of Turkey hiking rates, but not as much as expected. Lots of people thought they were going to do more to stem the weakening lira. The lack of a full hike as much as expected, causing a little bit of a drop in yields there.
Fairly mixed day for the U.S. dollar. So I want to focus here on the British pound. The UK's highest court ruled that Theresa May needs to seek parliamentary approval in order to trigger Brexit. This was pretty much as expected. The pound losing 0.25%. And I'm glad you mentioned Turkey because, as you mentioned, it raised its overnight lending rate by 75 basis points. And for now, it's not doing the job entirely, is it? Because the dollar rose 2/3% versus the lira. The next big hurdle here is whether Turkey forces banks to borrow through its so-called late liquidity window. If you look at the Turkish lira over a 3-month chart, you can see that it depreciated to a record low about 2 weeks ago. There's the peak in the chart, the dollar's peak in value versus the lira. And since then, it's been bouncing around in a range, and it remains stuck in that range.
Pretty ugly. Quick look at commodities. A fairly quiet day across the board. Oil really not doing much, and gold not doing much. The gold has sort of been doing what treasuries do, so treasuries sold off and gold sold off a little bit, but pretty quiet today in commodities.
Those are today's market minutes. Let's go back to the breaking news in Calgary, where Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is holding a news conference. This follows a cabinet retreat. And again, he is saying that he spoke to Donald Trump, the president of the U.S., about the benefits of the Keystone pipeline. And he says that the Keystone will deliver jobs for the province of Alberta. But he declined to comment on specifics, on details of the Keystone negotiations. So we'll continue to monitor these headlines for you and bring them to you as this continues. And of course, this comes on the day that the president did sign a memoranda advancing the construction of these pipelines. It wasn't a done deal, of course, but it moves them in that direction.
All right, I want to bring in Bloomberg's Margaret Talev, senior White House correspondent. Margaret, what is the big takeaway today from Donald Trump's actions?
Joey wants to create jobs. Just kidding. But no, look, you saw, again, the sort of explosion of activity here at the White House all around this economic message, which is job creation, U.S.-made products, and rolling back regulations and punishing folks who try to take jobs outside the U.S. and then sell the products back in the U.S. The morning, and it seems like 4 days ago, the morning began, as you know, with the visit from many automakers. Then the president president went on to release this sort of volley of close to a half a dozen executive actions memoranda on Keystone, on the Dakota pipeline, on the notion that this should involve U.S. steel, U.S. pipe and accessories, and U.S. jobs. So again, this pretty consistent jobs message.
And of course, we are again monitoring the news conference that Justin Trudeau is giving in Calgary right now. He's speaking there following cabinet retreat. He made some headlines here about the Keystone pipeline, Margaret, saying that he spoke to President Trump about the benefits of it. When we talk about the Keystone pipeline in the U.S., we tend to focus on the environmental impact of it and the pushback that it got from environmentalists, which is one reason why the Obama administration ended up rejecting it. What are the benefits of it for the United States? Are they significant?
You're right. Well, so look, there's various studies that the two sides cite, but you're right. When the Democratic president was in office, when it was President Obama, much of the focus was around the environmental debate. Now that President Trump is in office, this has become primarily a debate about the merits and also the symbolism of this in the U.S. But the environmental concerns remain among the environmental groups. We've seen a flurry of criticism and warnings about this all afternoon. It's just that the entire political dynamics are completely different. Democrats, both in Congress and in waiting, let's say, formerly in the executive branch, there's not really a whole lot that they can do about this other than politically and rhetorically. President Trump saying that he is concerned about some of the interest groups, particularly in the Dakota case, and that he considers himself an environmentalist, but also is against too much regulation. So these factors will continue to come into play in the debate, but in terms of instructing his agencies to move forward with reconsidering a resubmission, this is now on track to happen. In terms of jobs, how many jobs can be created. This is not what is going to, in and of itself, single-handedly build, a victory lap that President Trump could come back with a year from now in his State of the Union address. We're talking about, in the long term, a few thousand jobs probably being created. But look, there are more than 1,000 miles of pipeline in each of these cases, and certainly symbolically, the impact, particularly in this idea that it be U.S. steel, is an important political impact for President Trump if he wants to appeal in a crossover sense to some union members who may traditionally vote Democratic for union reasons. In fact, it was the Democrats in 2015 who brought forth the Keystone Amendment that would say that the pipeline would have to be built with U.S. steel. It was the Republicans at the time in Congress who rejected that.
Always partisan flipping after every election. Another news today, President Trump held meeting with the head of U.S. automakers as people are trying to figure out what kind of trade policy this administration is going to pursue. What did we learn from that meeting?
Well, what we learned from that meeting is really what we've learned in the first full 2 days in office, which is that we still need to see a lot of the details of precisely how tariffs or penalties would be imposed. But President Trump sending a very clear message to anyone who will come to the White House and be in the frame with him, which is he wants to reward people who create jobs inside the U.S., particularly in some of these Midwestern states, and he wants to penalize those who don't and act like it's no big deal. But look, automakers on the one hand, are very interested in being there to talk about cooperation with him. They see some incentives in terms of regulation or deregulation. But on the other hand, in terms of actual statistics, it may be difficult for President Trump to add significantly to the job creation trend in U.S. auto over the last couple of years. In fact, he may be just fighting market forces in kind of the opposite direction. And so for both of them, for both the president and for these automakers, there are certainly incentives to be getting together now and talking about these issues, but still not clear entirely how they'll play out.
And a quick question here, Margaret, on Jim Comey. The president has asked him to stay on. Of course, he came under a lot of fire, both from Republicans and Democrats alike. Did this request for Comey to stay on draw any kind of fire?
Yeah, it's really interesting because we asked White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer at today's briefing if he could just go ahead and make it official and tell us that that is what happened and some of the discussion behind it. And he said, no, I don't have any information for you right now. I'll have to check and get back to you. You saw hints of this a couple of days ago when President Trump gave Jim Comey that hug, that sort of bro hug there in the Blue Room with the law enforcement officers. it's a really interesting decision because many Democrats are very frustrated with Jim Comey over what they saw as his inappropriate kind of not meddling, but public pronouncements that became public, and whether that affected Hillary Clinton's shot at the presidency, the momentum in the waning days of that campaign. For President Trump, the FBI investigations of ties between Russia and folks inside his administration is something that, if he had pushed Jim Comey out, could have become a huge controversy. So this lays that to rest.
All right, Bloomberg's Margaret Talev, senior White House correspondent. Thank you very much.
And as we mentioned, Canada Prime Minister Justin Trudeau holding a news conference right now. Some more headlines coming out from this news conference. Trudeau says that Canada will continue to strengthen its Asia trade ties and that its NAFTA discussions with the Trump team are so far positive. That is a direct quote, positive. He also says that new border costs would be bad for both Canada and the United States. Justin Trudeau answering questions on a variety of issues, or at least addressing a variety of issues, including the Keystone pipeline, saying that he did speak to President Trump about the benefits of that pipeline and that it would deliver jobs for the province of Alberta. So once again, Justin Trudeau commenting here on trade negotiations with the United States. This is Bloomberg.
Our businesses and Canadian workers. But we also know that we have perspectives and an outlook that is deeply rooted in our sense of shared opportunity and respect for rights.
I'm Emma Chandra. Let's get to First Word News this afternoon. Senate committees have now approved 4 more of President Trump's cabinet nominees. They include Ben Carson at Housing and Urban Development, Elaine Chao at Transportation, Wilbur Ross at Commerce, and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley as the ambassador to the United Nations. Now the full Senate will vote on whether to confirm them. The Trump administration has instituted a media blackout at the Environmental Protection Agency. According to the AP, emails sent to EPA staff detailed the specific prohibitions, like banning press releases, blog updates, or posts to the agency's social media accounts. The Trump administration has also ordered a temporary suspension of all new business activities at the department. Hamas rulers are warning the U.S. not to move its embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. The Islamic militant group says such a step could unleash new violence. The Palestinian Authority has also urged President Donald Trump not to follow through on his campaign promise to move the embassy from Tel Aviv. The Palestinians seek East Jerusalem, captured by Israel in 1967, as their hoped-for capital. Global news. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Emma Chandra. This is Bloomberg. Scarlet.
Thank you so much. We have Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau holding a news conference right now following a cabinet retreat in Calgary. He's been making some headlines here saying that the Keystone pipeline will deliver jobs for Alberta and that he has spoken to the president about the benefits of Keystone. He's also added that he's held discussions on NAFTA with the Trump team that have been positive so far. So we will continue to monitor these headlines as the news conference continues. But let's talk a little bit more about those pipelines, because investors are betting that they will ease bottlenecks and boost the price of Canadian crude oil. Bigger picture, the question is, what kind of advantages can Canada press as Trump gets ready to renegotiate NAFTA? Let's bring in now Luke Kawa, Bloomberg Markets reporter, I should say, and Vince Ignorella, Bloomberg News' First Word FX analyst. Vince, let me start with you, because the Canadian dollar has been moving quite a bit, even before the Keystone pipeline news broke today, and much of it was on this idea that Canada will be able to negotiate something better for itself once NAFTA's ripped up.
There were good feelings that the bilateral trade negotiations between Trump and Trudeau would produce positive effects for the Canadian economy, as Canada is seen as much closer an ally to us than maybe Mexico is not as much of a competition.
Luke, we saw the loonies shoot up in response to the memorandum this morning. What does this actually mean for Canada's economy? How big of a deal is this?
So to me, it's almost like one way to interpret it is this big relief valve. Canada's been worried. The main phrase is collateral damage in essentially Trump going after Mexico on trade. So there seems to be this, idea that, okay, this is good. They're good with Keystone. They're good with trade with Canada. That extrapolation, might be a bit far. So far, I think all we learned today is that Trump is very kindly letting Canada be America's gas station, and that the idea of U.S. energy independence was always conditioned on the 51st state up north. So, in terms of other industries that are very construction intensive, primary metals, wood, and autos, where Trump's also shown a lot of protectionist leanings, those are the four main areas where Canada runs a trade surplus with the U.S. So that's cause to think that maybe we won't get so lucky on all of these.
And Luke's Canadian, so you can make jokes about Canada being the 51st state. Others can't get away with that. Vincent,
Yes.
With Trump's protectionist proposals, talk about NAFTA or wanting to renegotiate it, obviously the peso has really been taken to the woodshed.
Yes.
Is it possible that people are underestimating potential effects on Canada if there is some sort of wholesale renegotiation?
No, I think one of the things that's taken a lot of the pressure off Canada is as it's come to light that 35 states in the U.S., their largest export market is to Canada. So the bilateral trade is actually pretty evenly mixed. If you take out what Luke was just talking about, which are the energy exports, Canada actually has a deficit with the United States, not a surplus. So they're actually a very good trading partner, similar to Australia, for instance. So not the same type of pressure as Mexico. What we're seeing in Mexico is it's the peso. It's sold off so hard for so long that there's just been a bit of a reprieve. So it's gaining back some ground.
And maybe there's a reason that there's not so much pressure as Mexico, because really we've been hearing that Canada's been losing market share to Mexico when it comes to trade with the U.S. Canada's kind of lagging behind here, isn't it, Luke?
Oh, certainly, in a big way. And you can go back, dawn of the new millennium. Since then, Canadian outside of energy, real exports are up 8%, and energy exports are up 53%. So basically, all of our growth in the new millennium, past 16 years and counting, has come from that energy side, and a lot of that does come with the shift to Mexico in terms of market share, auto production, and U.S. population growth coming more in the south.
Question about domestic Canadian politics. Obviously, the left in this country was very anti-Keystone. What is the view within Trudeau's party? How split is it on this issue of the pipeline and further pipelines?
So while I'm sure that there are some within Justin Trudeau's party that aren't necessarily thrilled by Keystone as Excel, he very much struck a centrist message to win the election and win a majority, and he did support Keystone. He did come out in favor of it beforehand. So this is, I don't think it's something that's going to divide the party or cause any upheaval.
And just a quick, to put a chart to what you were saying earlier, walk us through this chart that you brought to us here, G#BTV 5685, the source of Canada's export growth. The white line here is what, Canada domestic energy products?
That's just the energy exports, so that's real shipments, so that's on a volume basis. So essentially what this shows is that, you know, you can see the drop in the yellow line. That's all of Canada's real exports, excluding energy. And you see, you know, the Great Recession hit, and we've kind of made headway there to get to right about where we were in 2001, 2002. So we really haven't had growth on that side. We've had growth on energy, and that speaks to kind of perpetuating the issue behind Keystone today, that Trump is willing to have Canadian energy, but he's also saying, hang on, I want that pipe built in America. I want it built with American products. So it's kind of perpetuating this issue.
U.S. Steel.
I want to ask you, Vince, about the dollar part of Dollar Lune. We have this sort of back and forth, yet one day the administration will try to jawbone the dollar lower or suggest that it thinks that the dollar is too high. It drops briefly, then bounces back. Today, the dollar bouncing back decently. Does the administration really have any influence? Does jawboning last more than a couple minutes?
They do have an influence, but you have to take things in context. I think Mnuchin's comments were an answer to a question of what would happen if the dollar would appreciate by 25%. That's a huge move. And essentially all he was saying is, yeah, short term that would be a detriment. It isn't really speaking towards an administration's real dollar policy. It was just to an answer to a question taken out of context. The state of the dollar going forward, especially with Canada, though, it's short term, this is actually dollar positive. Potential 42,000 jobs to the United States, and the ETA on the pipeline is somewhat maybe 5 years or so. So that oil for the exports to be generated to the U.S. is long term and down the line.
All right, Vince Canigurella, thank you so much. Bloomberg First Word FX reporter, and of course Luke Kawa of Bloomberg Markets. And we want to give you an update here on Alcoa. It just reported earnings, fourth quarter adjusted earnings per share 14 cents, missing the consensus estimate of 20 cents. Fourth quarter sales topping estimates $2.54 billion. Analysts were looking for $2.38 billion. So a miss on the bottom line, a beat on the top line. Alcoa shares down 1.3% in after hours trading. This is Bloomberg. Scarlet Fu. What'd you miss? We're going to take a deep dive now into the Bloomberg. You can find our charts using the function at the bottom of the screen. There is a big divergence when it comes to treasuries, opposing views in the market based on futures data for 5-year notes. So let's pull up this chart here because you can see it really highlighted when you look at the blue line, which is fast money. So hedge funds and other speculators, they've increased their bearish bets, and that's that line going down. The white line is real money accounts. Institutional buyers like mutual funds and insurers, they have built up their bullish positions. So it's really become a dramatic showdown. The question, of course, is who's going to win here. And according to JP Morgan's Jay Barry, fast money investors are a contrarian indicator. 75% of the time, the market moves the other way from their position over the following month.
It's remarkable because obviously they're diverged now. They often go in other directions, but this has just gotten so extreme here, the sort of different views of the two positions. So we'll be interested. Someone's going to make a lot of money and someone.
Yeah, we've never seen this kind of divergence, even in previous cycles, right? 2008, right. 2011, 2014, nothing like what we've seen here. This has just continued to build and build and build.
I'm also looking at a divergence in my Bloomberg terminal. If you have a terminal, G hashtag BTV 5686.
Divergence is the theme here.
It's the divergence between gold ETF flows in Europe, in Germany in particular, and gold ETF flows here in the United States. So we've talked about on the show a few times the SPDR gold ETF GLD has seen near constant outflows since the election. Virtually every day since the election, this ETF has seen money pulled out of it.
Pulling money out, right?
But it's not the case in Europe. The gold ETF that trades on the Xetra, the German exchange, has actually seen some big inflows, including last week, one of its biggest inflows ever. So the global view towards gold, those are the blue bars. That's the European one. The yellow one is U.S. Those have seen some real inflows, so sort of speaks to the perhaps different anxieties, more nervousness about, all the stuff that's going on in Europe. Political risk, all that stuff. Theoretically, there's political risk in the U.S., though, as we both know, no investor seems to be really worried about it right now.
Well, they've taken a glass-half-full approach to everything in the U.S. so far.
That's well put. People are concerned, but people aren't positioning themselves for anything bad happening right now, so pulling themselves out of GLD, but in Europe, they're putting the money in.
That's interesting, especially as gold prices have been doing fairly well at the start of the year as we approach the Lunar New Year.
Yeah, the flows don't match the price particularly.
No, they don't.
It does their own thing.
All right. Well, we are, of course, monitoring the news conference being held by Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He's addressed a number of issues, including trade with the United States. Among them, he says that he has spoken with the Trump administration about the Keystone pipeline. He also says that it will create jobs in Alberta as well. This is something, of course, that Donald Trump has mentioned, too, that the Keystone pipeline would increase jobs provided that it uses U.S.
And he also says the transition off fossil fuels is going to take a long time.
Which is something we knew.
Yeah.
All right, coming up, the UK's highest court ruled that Prime Minister Theresa May must pass an act of parliament before she can open divorce talks with the European Union. This is Bloomberg.
I'm Emma Chandra. Let's get to First Word News this afternoon. President Trump signed presidential memoranda today that advance the construction of two controversial pipelines. The Keystone pipeline was rejected under former President Obama, and work on the Dakota Access Pipeline has been stalled since September. Michigan environmental officials say Flint's water system no longer has levels of lead exceeding the federal limit. The finding by the Department of Environmental Quality is good news for a city whose 100,000 residents have grappled with the man-made water crisis since 2014. State officials say Flint's lead levels are now comparable to other U.S. cities. Minnesota Governor Mark Dayton says he's been diagnosed with prostate cancer, but will finish the final 2 years of his term. Dayton made the announcement today, just a day after collapsing while delivering his State of the State address, although he doesn't believe the two incidents are linked. The 69-year-old Democrat says he'll travel to the Mayo Clinic next week to discuss his prostate cancer treatment options. British Prime Minister Theresa May now has a new set of roadblocks before she can get the Brexit process started. The highest court in the UK has ruled that May must get Parliament's permission before triggering the 2-year countdown to leaving the European Union. The ruling came at the Supreme Court.
When the UK withdraws from the EU treaties, a source of UK law will be cut off. Further, certain rights enjoyed by UK citizens will be changed. Therefore, the government cannot trigger Article 50 without Parliament authorising that course.
The decision threatens the Prime Minister's March 31st deadline for starting the process. Some members of May's Conservative Party are concerned that she could hurt the economy by jeopardising trade to win control of immigration. Global news, 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Emma Chandra. This is Bloomberg. Joe.
Let's get a recap of today's market action. Green across the board, record highs for the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. You see there the big gainer of the major three indices was the NASDAQ. The Dow also doing well, adding 112 points, less than 100 points away from that 20,000 level that people have been looking for seemingly ever now.
All right, and we have some breaking news, this time from Texas Instruments, the chip maker, reporting fourth quarter earnings per share of $1.02 with a 14-cent benefit. The consensus estimate on a GAAP basis was for 81 cents. Fourth quarter revenue, $3.41 billion, higher than anticipated, and the outlook for revenue here is anywhere from $3.17 billion to $3.43 billion. If you find the average, that's about $3.3 billion, and that is higher than what analysts were looking for. They anticipated $3.23 billion. So you can see Texas Instruments moving around here in after-hours trading, currently down 0.1%. In addition, a change at the C-suite. Brian Crutcher has been promoted to COO of the company. So once again, Texas Instruments beating here when it comes to fourth quarter revenue and with its first quarter revenue outlook.
What'd you miss? UK Prime Minister Theresa May will be the first European leader through the door of Donald Trump's White House. May will visit Washington on Friday. This comes on the heels of today's Brexit hearing, where the UK Supreme Court decided May must pass an act of parliament before she can open divorce talks with the European Union. Here with us for more is European political commentator Nina Schick. Nina joins us on Skype in Berlin. Nina, thank you very much. So, by your estimation, let's start with the Supreme Court ruling. Does it change anything?
Well, it doesn't change the fact insofar as the UK will be leaving the EU. Where it can change matters is that now that parliamentary approval is required, both through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, that legislation might be amended. So the process might take a little bit longer. Now, Theresa May said that she will trigger Article 50 before the end of March. So the government is going to try and push this legislation through both houses with much gusto in order to meet that deadline. I think the House of Lords is the one where some interesting amendments might be made. I don't think we're going to see a revolution of MPs revolting and voting down Brexit. Brexit is still very much happening.
So Brexit is still happening. This March deadline is what might be in question here. This is a self-imposed deadline by Theresa May. What happens if she can't stick to her timetable? Does that give the advantage over to the EU?
Well, I think it makes it very tricky for her because let's not forget that this is a big year of elections on the continent as well. We have the Dutch elections coming up, the French elections, the German elections. So once you get too far into that electoral cycle, the rest of the EU is not really going to be able to engage with the UK. Now, Theresa May has a strategy here. She wants to say by 2020, when the general election will be held in the UK, that she has delivered Brexit. So she wants to use these 2 years to at least negotiate the UK's formal withdrawal from the EU. The next question then, though, is will there be a transitory agreement, a bridging period in between? Because Theresa May has already made clear that her final endpoint with the EU is to have a wide-reaching FTA along the lines of the FTA that Canada has with the EU. But in that interim period, from divorce to free trade agreement, will there be a transitory agreement? And that very much depends on the rest of the EU.
So let's talk about the rest of the EU. As mentioned before, Theresa May coming to the U.S. later this week. She'll be the first world leader to visit Donald Trump at the White House. What do continental European leaders think right now about the new administration?
Well, I think continental European leaders are rather horrified at events in the US, and they see Brexit as being part of this global wave of populism or anti-establishment anger that we saw sweeping the United Kingdom with the Brexit vote and also with the election of Donald Trump. So I think that automatically puts European leaders on the defensive. And it's very interesting, of course, because the most powerful leader of Europe, Angela Merkel, who I reckon will be elected for her fourth term as Chancellor, she is almost symbolically seen as the last bastion of Western liberalism. So I think this means that the rest of the EU's position vis-a-vis Brexit with the UK, when talks get underway, they're going to be very, very tough.
And of course, they'll be monitoring what happens when Theresa May comes and visits the U.S. and meets with President Trump. How important is it for Theresa May to secure a speedy trade agreement with the U.S. before turning her focus and really negotiating with the EU?
Well, I would argue that her primary focus, of course, the U.S. is an important trade partner for the UK, but I would argue that the UK's priorities are primarily securing its future relationship with the EU, because 44% of the UK's exports go to the EU, and by virtue of its EU membership, it's also privy to trade agreements with over 50 other countries, so that accounts for over 60% of its trade. Now, that most important market. So, of course, whilst it should be concentrating on the not forget, the most important thing for the UK is actually what is its relationship going to be with its closest partners, both geographically, economically, and history, rather than its relations with the US. And interestingly in the UK, whilst many people have welcomed Donald Trump's comments that, there can be some kind of bilateral trade deal, I think other people are also wary as to whether or not they can trust President Trump's, assertions that this can indeed be done, and whether this would indeed be a win-win deal for the UK or a win-lose deal with the advantage going to the US.
And when we follow the rhetoric on Brexit in the UK, it's very domestically focused. What kind of unity is there among the different European states? I mean, you mentioned how Angela Merkel is seen as the last standing liberal democratic leader in Western Europe, but are the nations of Europe united in how they approach the UK?
I think that, of course, traditionally, EU has many, many divides and differences. But when it comes to the issue of Brexit, I think that the EU27 are going to speak with a very united voice, because anything that might harm the integrity of the single market or the union, thus far at least, given that, populist parties aren't yet in power in any of the major European countries, is really going to be seen as a threat. So they're going to be very united. And I think the interesting thing is, thus far, the debate in the UK, at least, has been about what the UK can demand and what it's going to ask for in the negotiations. But I think once the talks actually get underway, the EU is going to make some very tough asks of the UK. So that might come as a bit of a shock.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to ask you about, because in Theresa May's recent speech, she said, yeah, I know we can't really be part of the single market, but don't take a punitive stance toward us in these debates, because your companies will have a lot to lose without free trade to the UK. Is she right that the rest of Europe can't afford to be hard on the UK, or is she sort of overplaying her hand there in terms of how much leverage she has?
I think, of course, she has to go in hard as a prime minister, knowing that she's actually walking away from the single market. But if we're real here, I mean, realistically, of course, if the UK leaves, that is a blow to the EU, losing one of the biggest member states, one of the biggest economies. London, you know, the financial center of the EU. Nonetheless, the 27 still have more clout. And ultimately, it's the 27 who get to decide what kind of access the UK gets to the single market. I mean, once Article 50 is triggered, that's it. You know, the UK doesn't have a say anymore. Of course, it can negotiate, but the final deal is what the EU 27 puts to the UK, and the UK then has to take it or leave it. And given that it's still the world's largest market, it's hugely important to the UK. And of course, it will be the weaker negotiating partner. Right. It has interesting things that can put on the table in return. But I think we haven't seen much thinking as to what the UK can offer the EU 27 to make the deal a little bit sweeter yet.
All right, European political analyst Nina Schick, thank you very much.
Coming up, Nina was just talking about the populist wave that's sweeping across Europe. The Netherlands, a big part of that. We're going to break down the upcoming Dutch elections. This is Bloomberg.
What do you miss? A populist surge is sweeping through Europe and the U.S., and it looks like the next domino to fall could be in the Netherlands. The Dutch Freedom Party, led by Geert Wilders, is leading in all the polls ahead of the March 15th elections. I spoke to Bloomberg's government reporter, Eddie Buckle, earlier today to get his thoughts on the matter.
Well, right now it looks like the Freedom Party of Geert Wilders, which is anti-Islam and is pro-getting out of the European Union, is going to top the polls. But it's unlikely to be able to form a government. It's only going to get about a quarter of the seats in Parliament at the most.
So the expectation is that even if the party comes in as the majority, there's no way it could form a coalition. So who is likely, what is the likely coalition going to look like?
Well, at the moment, the Liberals of Prime Minister Mark Rutte are running in second place, so he may well be in a position to continue in government, but he's going to need 4 or even 5 other parties to be able to put together a coalition with enough seats in Parliament, because it's a very, very fragmented political situation in the Netherlands.
So if that's the case, that the next coalition needs 4 or 5 parties, how much of a collapse would that represent from the existing coalition in terms of needing to shore up support?
Well, at the moment, it's the Liberals and the Labour Party. Together, they have just over half the seats in Parliament, so it's a 2-party coalition at the moment. Support for the mainstream parties in the Netherlands really has collapsed. It sort of echoes the situation elsewhere in Western Europe, where the traditional parties don't get as much support and insurgent parties have come through. But it's particularly marked in the Netherlands because there's such a broad spectrum of parties available for voters to back.
Right, so going back to the Freedom Party, obviously that is the big story, the fact that they're likely to come in first in the number of seats. They're referred to as right-wing. Do they also draw from some formerly left-wing voters, people who are concerned about sort of traditional labor concerns or old-style labor concerns like immigration, general changes in the economy?
There's certainly those concerns are marked in the Netherlands, though there are more left-wing parties in the Netherlands, like the Green Party and the Socialist Party, that have been drawing extra support as well. And there are other sort of insurgent parties as well, like a party for older voters. They've also been drawing increased support. So the fragmentation is there. In other areas, it's not just the right wing that's drawing extra votes.
So you mentioned that the Freedom Party is currently on pace to get about a quarter of the vote. What's the high end of the range, or what's a result where people can say, wow, we really underestimated this trend once again?
Well, there are 150 seats in the Dutch Parliament. If they were getting more than 40, that would be quite worrying, because it would restrict the ability of the other parties to form a functioning coalition after March the 15th. But if anything, the support for the Freedom Party seems to be just tailing off slightly in the last couple of weeks. So we're not at the moment expecting a really big further surge by them. But anything can happen, and as you know, polls can be wrong.
Right. Has anything that's happened in other countries, whether it's the election of Donald Trump in the U.S., the Brexit vote, had an impact on how voters view their own situation in the Netherlands?
The Trump vote in the Netherlands, the Trump vote in the United States, certainly saw an increased support for Geert Wilders and the Freedom Party. That effect may just be tailing off at the moment, but you know, they have lots of similarities, Geert Wilders and Donald Trump. Right. It's not just the hairstyle. They've also been fairly short on detail of what their party program would look like if they get into power. They've just issued a single sheet of paper, and that's as far as it goes on policy.
That was Bloomberg's Eddie Buckle in London.
Up next, the political uncertainty, not the only topic discussed at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Bloomberg spoke with pioneers of workplace diversity and equality, including Sheryl Sandberg and Tina Brown. This is Bloomberg. What'd you miss? Almost 80% of delegates at the World Economic Forum are men. And while the gender divide does seem stark, there are plenty of female leaders at Davos who are talking loud and clear about how to bridge that inequality in Davos and in the workplace. Walk the Talk caught up with Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook, to talk about the role that male colleagues play in that process.
If you can use the full talents of the population rather than half, you're going to outperform your peers. And that's true whether you're the entry-level employee where no one reports to you, but you're just better to work with, or you're the chief marketing officer of Unilever or the CEO. You're going to do better. And so I think if we can convince, companies to market to women against stereotypes because it'll sell their products, if we can convince men to do their share at home and to fight gender bias in the workplace because they'll be happier, more successful in both fronts, that's where the win is.
Girls don't want to sit in a basement somewhere and play Minecraft, right? They want to build something. They want to solve a problem. And so when you connect technology to things that girls are interested in, whether that's climate change or mental health or, finding a cure to cancer or, saving a pet that's lost, when you connect it to the things that they care about, they get excited about technology. We need to make it relevant for them.
This is a moment when women have really I think this is a moment when the millennial women who were really rather uninterested are coming together with the older women who kept telling them, actually, be careful, because if you just take it all for granted and think, oh, my mums did all that, that was just like, we don't need that anymore. Women are totally, they want all their rights. They don't need anything. To realize that rights can be dialed back, and that rights have to be fought for every day. And I think that's been a huge wake-up call.
And that's just a sampling of some of the women we spoke to for Walk the Talk at the World Economic Forum in Davos. But we also turned into what the men had to say. eBay's CEO Devin Wenig shared with Bloomberg's Walk the Talk contributor Shelley Zalis why he thinks tech is contributing to rising nationalism and how his company is trying to level the playing field when it comes to women in the C-suite.
Technology disruption has not been distributed equally. And this is what's causing populism and the rise of nationalism. That's a real issue. And I do think that responsible leadership needs to Davos can be an echo chamber. And it can be, we know what's right and everything is fine and we got this. Obviously, we don't got this because there are a lot of pissed off people around the world. And at the end of the day, there are not enough people here to vote their way. There are national elections that matter. Democracy matters. So I do think there needs probably to be a course correction. We were really early in Silicon Valley about publishing our data on women in our leadership team. And I think that's awesome. And it wasn't pretty when we first published it, which was 3 years ago. Like it was early.
Where were you 3 years ago?
I mean, in our senior leadership team, we were south of 20% on the senior leadership team. And it took a lot of, so you have a moment where you say, are we actually going to go out there with this because we're going to get criticized? Once it's out there and people feel uncomfortable, we've gone up and up and up, and now we're close. We're in the 40s, and we've made massive progress. Like, we're not done, just to be clear. Like, we have a lot more to do, and as my head of inclusion reminds me, there are a lot of there are ethnic minorities and others who still have terrible representation in our company and in our leadership team.
That was Devin Wenig, eBay's CEO at Davos. And we just want to remind you that eBay will be reporting fourth quarter results after the bell tomorrow. And, of course, we'll be breaking those numbers and bringing you the latest. Joe?
It's time now for the Bloomberg Business Flash, a look at some of the biggest business stories in the news right now. Fannie Mae has agreed to back a $1 billion mortgage loan to Blackstone Group's Invitation Homes. It's the first time the taxpayer-supported housing giant has supported a company with a focus on single-family home rentals in the U.S. The deal is designed to cut borrowing costs for Invitation Homes as it preps to go public. The 10-year fixed-rate loan made by Wells Fargo is expected to be packaged into bonds. Walgreens Boots Alliance CEO Stefano Pessina believes the deal to buy Rite Aid is still a go, but can't say whether the companies will extend the deal just 3 days from their agreed deadline. Both companies agreed to close the planned $9.4 billion merger, which would create the largest drugstore chain in the U.S. by store count on Friday. But the deal still hasn't received antitrust approval from the FTC. Currency trading fell across major global centers, including London, New York, and Tokyo. That's according to biannual surveys from the world's central banks. In the UK, average daily trading for spot, forward, swaps, and options fell to $2.18 trillion in October, down 2% from April. Trading in North America fell 1.3% to about $880 billion. And under mounting pressure from an activist investor to split up, Bob Evans has agreed to sell its restaurant business to private equity firm Golden Gate Capital. The sale is for $565 million, plus the assumptions of net working capital liabilities of $40 million to $50 million. The stock is soaring in late trading on the news. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash.
Coming up, what you need to know to gear up for tomorrow's trading day. This is Bloomberg. What'd you miss? The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq closing at record highs. Now, in terms of what's coming up, don't miss this. Japan's trade balance due out later tonight, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time.
And I'll be looking at some U.S. data in the morning related to housing, MBA mortgage apps, and FHFA home prices.
And, of course, we'll get new home sales the day after. And, of course, the earnings parade continues. We've got Qualcomm, AT&T, Boeing, and eBay tomorrow. It's just getting started.
Lots of earnings coming up.
And coming up on Bloomberg Tech, Republican Senator Mike Lee will be joining the program to discuss trade and cybersecurity. That is at the top of the hour in just a couple of minutes. That does it for What You Missed. Thanks for watching.
Have a great evening. This is Bloomberg.
And you're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's start with a check of your first word stories. Senate committees have approved 4 more cabinet picks of the Trump administration. They include Ben Carson at Housing and Urban Development, Elaine Chao at Transportation, Wilbur Ross at Commerce, and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley as the ambassador to the United Nations. Now the full Senate will vote whether to confirm them. Meantime, President Trump signed presidential memoranda today that advanced the construction of the Keystone and Dakota Access pipelines, which were either rejected or stalled during the Obama administration. Mr. Trump also had a breakfast meeting with CEOs and top executives of the big three U.S. automakers, General Motors, Ford, and Fiat Chrysler, and promised to make the U.S. more business-friendly by cutting regulations. FBI Director James Comey will keep his job. Comey says President Trump asked him to stay on, and he agreed. Mr. Trump criticized the FBI and Justice Department for not bringing criminal charges against Hillary Clinton for her use of a personal email server. Michigan officials say Flint's water system no longer has levels of lead exceeding the federal limit. The city's 100,000 residents have been grappling with the water crisis there since 2014. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Elisa Parenti. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg Technology is next.
I'm Caroline Hyde. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up, the tech earnings parade marches on, with Alibaba leading the charge, how the bets on content in the cloud are paying off for China's e-commerce giant. Plus, new market highs. Both the S&P 500 and Nasdaq hit record levels as corporate earnings roll in. We'll break down which stocks are leading the gains. And the Verizon-Yahoo deal is still in play, but now going into overtime. We'll look into potential impacts on the acquisition after Verizon's worst performance report since 2011. First to our lead. Alibaba shares popping after China's biggest e-commerce company reported better than expected quarterly results. Also encouraging investors, the company lifted its yearly sales forecast as spending in the world's second biggest economy stays strong. Alibaba's new ventures, like its cloud computing arm and its Netflix-like division Youku, are bolstering the giant retailer. Now, joining us from New York, Tin Culpen. He writes about Asia technology for Bloomberg Gadfly. That's Bloomberg's fast commentary section. And Bloomberg technology reporter Selena Wang. Selena, first to you. Sales beat, profit beats, forecasts upgraded. Dig into the nitty-gritty for us.
I know, it's almost too good to be true. Another quarter, they beat on the top line, they beat on the bottom line, they even raised sales forecast. Something that was interesting, though, is that the core business, the annual active buyers, that number actually didn't grow very much. It grew less than 10%. So a lot of the growth, a lot of the reasons why investors are pushing up the stock today, it's because of the growth and its more fledgling businesses. We saw triple-digit growth in its cloud computing division. We also saw triple-digit growth in its media digital entertainment business. So a lot of talk about how that's the next new growth strategy for Alibaba and how they're going to integrate all of these businesses together.
I mean, just digging into some of the Bloomberg functions, if you go into analyst recommendations, you go into Alibaba, get into ANR on the Bloomberg, you will see phenomenal 90% of analysts, that's 42 out of the 47, say buy this stock. Not one single one says sell, 10% say hold. We saw in Deutsche Bank, Cantor, all upgrade their price targets today. And you'll see, though, that still the price target is way off where the price, much higher than where the share price is currently trading. Tim, elaborate on these new big bets that potentially is helping some of these buy recommendations. We heard there from Selena about the entertainment. Where's the juice here?
Well, look, really what it comes down to is this. They've got cloud, and what's interesting is their cloud business, it is a fledgling business, it's growing. But what's interesting is if you dig through the numbers, the cloud business ARPU is actually rising and staying stable. Normally we see these businesses, when they grow, you get less revenue per user because some of the lower tier users come in and start using it. But in fact, it's staying stable, and that's a really good sign for Alibaba. Now, it's still losing money, to be sure, so that's, of course, not a good sign. But the fact that they're able to keep that stable is very, very important for them. And then, of course, on the entertainment side as well, and again, it's losing money, but it's growing. And these are two areas that show that Alibaba is looking into and can actually find some success out of their main business, which is simply selling products online. So these two new areas, really, they are drag on earnings right now, but the fact that they're growing shows that Alibaba has a few more tricks up its sleeve.
And Selena, what it really feels like is that Alibaba is morphing into an Amazon here, taking a few leaves out of their book. What did the executives say about these new businesses?
I think something that people are expecting more details on was this deal with In Time. It's several $billion for Alibaba. They want to buy out this physical brick-and-mortar department store, and this is part of Jack Ma's vision to transform offline retail and integrate it with some of these e-commerce initiatives. So I think some analysts are still pretty skeptical of, is it really worth it to spend that much on physical retail? But Alibaba now is all about e-commerce. Is so yesterday. We're now about integrating digital media, using content to draw users, leveraging our data to get people to spend more time on our platforms, and to transform physical retail so that people in brick-and-mortar stores can use our technology to shop better, which, as you mentioned, is not too different from what Amazon's doing. They recently opened grocery stores that use very advanced technology, and they also have some physical bookstores.
Tim, I think we heard just Selena there talking about maybe there is still a little bit of caution out there. Interesting, you look at the short interest on this particular stock, and it's actually relatively high despite all the buys and the holds that we have, something Selena that pointed out earlier. What are the risk factors that might be driving this short interest?
Well, look, one of the key ones, which Selena just pointed out, is the fact that their user growth is slowing. They're now in single-digit user growth. That's a problem for them, of course, but they are managing to grow the amount of sales per user. But really, the other thing is that they've got a lot of other businesses. They're, of course, invested in Ant Financial and so many other different kinds of businesses, and they're a little bit of a black box. So a lot of the shorts are really betting on the fact that there is problems here. But so far, the shorts who've been trying to have a go at shorting the stock over the last few years haven't really paid out. So there's been a lot of people probably losing money, I'd be guessing, on trying to short the stock. Again, we're seeing this again. A lot of people betting that perhaps there is something to come out of this that will be on the downside. But so far, they really haven't been able to make much money from those short bets.
They certainly haven't thus far. And Selena, what about, we broke the news with you earlier about the Olympic bet that is being made by Alibaba as well. Any more flesh to the bones of the direction that Alibaba is going in terms of globalization?
I think executives really were reiterating that this is something that's really going to get our global brand out there. As they try to get about half of the revenue from abroad, it's really important that they can elevate their brand. Tim was just talking about some risk factors earlier. Let's also not forget that they were just put back on the USTR's list, Notorious Markets list, for being a haven for knockoffs. So because by sponsoring the Olympics, they're now going to have their name associated with the Olympic Games around the world, and hopefully this can bolster their reputation and help more businesses to sign onto their platforms.
As ever, brilliant analysis. Selena Wang, Bloomberg technology reporter, thank you. And Tim Kilpin of Bloomberg Gadfly, you're going to be sticking with me because on the tech earning front, Samsung's profit more than doubled in the last 3 months of 2016 on robust semiconductor sales. It was also driven by a recovery in its mobile business after the fire-prone Galaxy Note 7 debacle. Now, the company will also buy back $8 billion worth of its own shares, which will be cancelled. And Tim, we saw the shares pop on the back of this, largely due to the buyback. And is this just to try and placate the investor base that has been through a crisis or two?
Yeah, look, I think it is. You know, it was a very large buyback, but it was only around about 10 to 12% of the cash they've got on hand. So it was a large number, but really they've got a lot more cash that they could be giving back to shareholders, either through buybacks or through actual dividends. So really, I agree that the pop is based on that. If you look at the actual earnings themselves, year on year, the top line basically didn't change. It came in at almost exactly the same number, but going through the line we saw gross margin improve quite a lot, and that's simply because their semiconductor side and their LCD side did very, very well during the period, and those are very capital intensive and depreciation heavy kind of businesses. So when sales go up there, you've got better gross margins. But I got to say that if that can go forward into the next few quarters, that's great, but I'd be skeptical that they could, because these are very cyclical businesses, supply demand driven, and we need to see something going through in the next few quarters that will drive demand for NAND, flash memory, DRAM memory, even LCDs. And there's really not a lot out there in the market in terms of new products that looks like it could drive these areas. So that would be a real threat for Samsung going in the next few quarters.
So a bit of a stay of execution if you're looking at the share price, but what about